This video, we're going to look at the global scale of bicycle manufacturing. Stay tuned to find out what small Italian bike manufacturers have in common with cast iron cooking pots. So I've come up with this kind of chart which shows a number of brands, their production methods and their approximate units of production per year. We're going to look at a case study of a brand that's in a very, very interesting position in terms of their production quantity, and they're trying to keep things in Europe, trying to keep things in Italy. They're Officine Matteo, they're based in northwest Italy near Cuneo in Liguria, I think it is. No, it's Piemonte actually, but the frames are made in Liguria, and that's something we'll talk about. Can they be a global artisan? Is that an oxymoron? Can you actually be artisanal but go global? It's a fine balance of tension. We'll look at some other brands that have done it outside of the bicycle industry, maybe Beretta shotguns as well, because they've got a custom arm and a very much off the peg arm that's still made in Italy. The compatriots of Officine Matteo, they're no longer in Italy, and I think people just don't see them patriotically anymore. And then we'll look at the, what does global artisan actually mean? Is it via numbers, like production or sales, or is it in just reputation or reach? We'll look at the problems with carbon fiber and how it doesn't really lend itself to making more and more bikes, and maybe this kind of niche manufacturing is the future. I've just finished the Alpi del Mare Gran Fondo near Cuneo in northwest Italy. Harder than it was on paper, so it's 1900 meters of climbing, I think, and 100 kilometers. Did it in 3.5 hours, not too bad. Tomorrow I'm going to be going to the factory to have a look at the carbon construction, and shout out to David who invited me here, because I'm not really a dealer. Most of the guys here on this trip are dealers riding these bikes, prospective dealers who are looking to stock these bikes in the UK, but they are handmade in Italy. And I was invited out to ride one on this Gran Fondo, I guess, to give my feedback and do a little review. I'm not getting paid to be here. Cheap flights, aren't they? EasyJet. So I said, why not? So I'll have a quick look at the bike. It's handmade in Italy. All these Officine Matteo bikes are handmade in Italy. They are a tubed to tube and wrapped construction, which some may say is a little bit old school. Actually, that's how I made my bamboo bike when I was at university many years ago. Tube to tube construction and then overwrapped. But the bike I was riding today was an SL. It's kind of a traditional road bike, sloping top tube, lots of seat posts sticking out, and very comfy. Coming on to the scale, this is something I put together to help you visualize what it's like in terms of the bike production scale. So I've worked in the industry for a couple of years when I lived in Hong Kong. I was a production engineer for a big brand, but it was very eye-opening, and it got me into Chinese factories. It got me into carbon factories, and then later on in my career I actually used one of those original suppliers to help with a robotics project I was working on at the time. So fairly well qualified to talk about this, because like I said, I have worked in it, and I've got sources that are still working in it, and people close to me have given me these numbers and the research, so I'm very grateful for that. So let's look at the scale. And like I put here, more production does not always mean more automation. And that's kind of a weird one, isn't it? Because if you think about Morgan sports cars versus Porsche, so Morgan sports cars are a very small boutique kind of custom sports car manufacturer based in the UK. Okay, I think they're still using ash in some of the frames. Yes, that's wood, not burnt wood, but ash is a type of hardwood. But largely, I think they're now moving towards aluminium monocoque. Another company that uses aluminium monocoque would be Porsche. More automation in Porsche, isn't there? Of course there is. A much bigger volume. Those chassis are welded with ABB or FANUC industrial robots, but you don't get that on the smaller scales. However, carbon doesn't always lend itself to being more automated in production, which is why it's very hard to scale up and keep the costs down. I heard a lot of people yesterday on the Gran Fondo saying, oh, these frames are handmade, and these are customers as well as potential customers, and they really speak very highly of Officine Matteo because they're locals and there's a very passionate kind of following of the brand. It's a massive brand in this area. Obviously it employs quite a lot of people as well. The riders that I spoke to on the course yesterday were saying, well, these are handmade. And I'm like, guys, all frames in China and Taiwan are handmade. They're just on a much bigger scale. It showcased that the local talent is here making composites. And yes, automotive and naval engineering, that's great marketing for people who want to buy a carbon fiber bike. And I think, because obviously this is a luxury product, and so showcasing that I think is really valuable. And this presentation is only going to take into account carbon, because Officine Matteo, the case study in question, they do actually make bikes out of steel as well. On the left, we've got around 60 frames per year, and then the big hitters, Specialized and Giant, and I've got their figures roughly, I think, correct. I think I'm pretty good on the Specialized one. The Giant one I've had to take from revenues, and that's really hard because you have to dive into sector sales and stuff like that to work back to units in production, and then you have to split it between aluminium and carbon. So roughly correct, I think, as an average over the last kind of rolling average over the last 5 years. Now, where does Officine Matteo fit in? And we'll see the Officine Matteo production process in this video because I got into the factory, and theirs is a very unique kind of atelier model. So they don't actually own their own factory yet. Maybe they will, but they're using a small composites manufacturer specialist down the road in Liguria near Genova. So I went there. They were quite cagey about me filming stuff because there were some stuff in production from other clients or other interests, let's say, and mainly that is motorsport. The irony is the companies further to the left on this chart, the companies making less bikes per year, actually have a more automated and a much more refined production process. So we've got framework, probably one of the best quality bikes I've ever seen ridden from an engineering point of view. They're making about 60 frames a year this year. That's what they'll average on. Then you've got Atherton, which sit very close to Officine Matteo. So about 500 frames I think they made last year. It's a little bit difficult, that figure, because they started to make aluminium frames that year as well. And they're obviously making loads of marketing samples and press samples and stuff. But 500 to 600 is about where Atherton and Officine Matteo lie. Now, I think that's kind of getting towards the top end of custom frame builder territory. Officine Matteo do set sizes, set geometry in all of their bikes, but they do offer a custom frame charge. Now, further on to the list, you've got the Chinese makers. Now, this is interesting. This is once supplier turned competitor now, isn't it? Because these brands are making their bikes in-house. There's little conflict of interest. They've got the QC, they've got the production, they've got the testing, the ISO testing. Their marketing and distribution is a bit sketchy, but that is rapidly improving, and they're making around 3,000 to 5,000 units a year in carbon frames. At the top here, we've got Specialized and Giant. And Specialized, I have to say, is the outlier on all of this chart. Now, why do you think Specialized is unique on this chart? This is kind of a broad spectrum of brands across the whole production scale, and they are the only brand outsourcing production. Now, if you look at the other big Western brands, Cannondale, Trek, Albert, they do the same, but this is, I think, the thorn in their side, and it has been since COVID and before COVID, because they've got a massive conflict of interest in the supplier. Okay, they might have exclusivity in suppliers, but they're outsourcing. So if they're chasing deadlines to say, I need 10,000 units shipped by Q2 2026, if their supplier doesn't meet that deadline, they have to issue them a credit note. The brand doesn't want credit notes because it's useless to them. According to their forecast, as good as the brand's forecast is, those bikes are sold. And if they're not shipped at that date, that's lost sales. So there's a little bit of conflict of interest there. The suppliers are just like, we have to do whatever we can through pandemics, through lack of manpower, through maybe shifting some through QC that shouldn't have passed. We have to meet those deadlines. But they're the only brand on this list that has to do that. Giant, holistically, okay, yes, there are other manufacturers for them, but they kind of own them. So that is manufacturing in-house to some extent. Yolio, Winspace, yes. Officine Matteo, yes. Atherton, definitely yes. And Frameworks, definitely yes, because there's only one guy making those. Specialized are the outlier in this. And I think going forward, more and more manufacturing is going to be brought in-house, and that's where these two in the middle here, Winspace and Yolio, have such strength. And not just them, I mean, it's pretty much all the Chinese brands now that are bringing their brand out, not just their open mold catalog or their production catalog. They've got their own brands now, and they will be replacing these big Western brands in the next 20 years. And the gap is left for these in-housing brands that haven't done the offshoring. I think Colnago, that's a difficult one because they've got, some will say, unlimited funding from Chimera. You know, it's a UAE-based backer now. They own pretty much all of Colnago. What's going to happen with that, I'm not sure. But the bigger brands, the Western brands, I think are going to suffer. Anyway, going back to manufacturing methods before I get lost in the economics of it. Well, the bottom end of the scale, we've got tube to tube. Now, going back in the bicycle industry for 60, 70 years, this is your bread and butter. This is how you'd make a metal bike. You take your tube, you miter it, and you put it together on a welding jig. Now, that could be steel, could be aluminium, could be titanium. But in terms of carbon, it evolved to use lugs. Also, like steel bikes were brazed with lugs. And that is probably still the go-to method for very small production, and it's lugged tube to tube. Framework is doing the lugs by CNCing aluminium. Atherton is doing the lugs by 3D printing titanium. You end up with a very similar result. There's arguments to which is better. Obviously, TI can be a bit lighter. 3D printing enables a bit more complex geometry in the lug. Then you've got Officine and Matteo, tube-to-tube construction, but they're overwrapping the joints. And they also are wrapping the joints on the inside as well, which is kind of like their their cherry on the cake. They would say it's an internally wrapped system, so you get a much better compaction on the inside and on the outside. Everyone looks inside bike frames now before they build them up. And then in the middle here, you've got the move to what I call monocoque or semi-monocoque production, which is your typical massive 2/2 steel mold put together, internally inflated with a bladder. In terms of semi-monocoque, you've got your front triangle and rear triangle that is then glued together. Semi-monocoque is way more forgiving in production. There's less wastage, there's less scrappage. Why is that? If you mold your front triangle and your rear triangle in one massive steel mold, and it pops out the mold with a defect, a massive void, or it warps, which it will do because it's carbon fiber, you throw it away. So the yield is much, much lower, it's more expensive. Windspace, using a supply called Flybiking Wejo, I've been there myself. They're using a full monocoque for the SLC3 and SLC5. Very specialist, and it does make a very, very lightweight frame, but at a cost. And that's why those frames are quite expensive. Where you do a semi-monocoque, which is what I'd say is when you do your front triangle and your rear triangle, like 95% of the bike industry does, you've got the chance to align it in a jig. So when you bond your rear triangle to your front triangle, if there's any misalignment in those two parts, you can get around it by slight bonding jigs. So you can put the epoxy on the rear triangle, the seat stays down, the chain stays. When you slide it into the front triangle, you hold the geometry correct in the jig, and your slight misalignments and warpage can be taken out. So that's what 95% of the bike industry does, and that's the way forward. However, the irony is, further to the left on this list, and I'm talking about framework and Atherton, there is more automation at the bottom of production than there is at the top. So the problem with pre-preg carbon fiber, like I compared to aluminium monocoques in the car industry, is pre-preg carbon fiber is very hard to automate when you're laying it up. Now, big industry like aerospace, 787 wings or A350 wings do use something called AFP, which is automated fiber placement, which was where you've got big robots wrapping the impregnated carbon to make those structures. But in terms of bikes, even at very, very high volume production, because the price has to be met, the $400-500 max unit price of a frame has to be met. You can't use that. So we use skilled workers to lay it up. Now, you don't have more automation, you just have more hands. You have more ladies in the layup lab doing the layup at the top. Okay, Giant may use some basic robotics to automate a little bit of fiber placement on the top end SL bikes like the TTR SL, but on the whole, it's very, very handmade still at the top end. Now, like I said, the irony is, down here at the bottom, Frameworks only making 60 bikes per year. Everything in that production process, apart from gluing the tube into the lug, which is essentially as easy as sliding it in, everything is automated. The human cost there is developing the machines that make them. So those tubes are essentially robotically wrapped on a winding machine, and the lugs are cut by CNC, and it's the same with Atherton, except the lugs are 3D printed. Now, there's a lot of investment in programming and developing the hardware for those machines because they're custom made in terms of the framework. And in Atherton's case, they've got a manufacturing partner in Renishaw to do the 3D printing for the lugs. However, Officine Matteo are still doing everything by hand, and then we'll come on to their production process now. So as a case study, I would say the Officine Matteo production process is very good at lending itself to custom geometry, which they offer, and frame sizes. However, it's very, very slow. And it's slower than, like I said, the guys below them in terms of production numbers. And it all comes down to this hand mitering, gluing, and then racking process. It's not a very fast production method. And I, having visited the factory, I guess each frame is at least half a day's worth of one worker just for the sanding. When they put all the 3M glue on the joins to kind of tack weld it, and they're using that epoxy to kind of tack weld it, is that being made redundant after you do the overwrapping? Probably yes, because most of it's sanded off for aesthetic, but I don't think they're going to do 600 frames a year forever. So they will be looking to grow. And what engineering models or production models can they take on to increase their yield but stay as an artisan? We went down the crazy highway to Liguria, to Genova, and there's a little factory, unassuming place. Here is Matteo outside the factory. This factory isn't owned, I don't think, or it may have shares owned by Officine Matteo, but it's owned by a local carbon company, which I found out when I was there, called Pedemonte. They are a specialist carbon company. They've cut their teeth in rally, body parts, and motorsport. They've made parts for Ferrari, I think, like GT cars, Lamborghini GT cars. And the owner is clearly a motorsport fan, hence the GR Yaris in the back. So I saw that. I saw the GR Yaris with the body kit. I saw the autoclave and thought, well, we're in good hands here. They're also making bikes for Officina Mattia. I don't know what the financial relationship is, but it seems like when I was there, I found out and pointed to my peers that Pedemonte Bike exists as a kind of owner of the IWS wrapping system, and Officina Mattia may be a customer. Don't take that for gospel. I'm not completely sure. It's good to know from my point of view that there are other manufacturing interests in that factory because they've clearly got expertise. So I saw a swim ladder for a super yacht in there. I saw a splitter for a rally car. They're making all sorts of different carbon parts for the GR Yaris, and it's for me that's a really good marketing point because I think it goes, like I said, I think it goes hand in hand with the potential customers. But they were very cautious about us filming, which is absolutely fine. So I did try and keep the camera basic only on the bike pass. So the first step in the production is they are molding the tubes in-house and mitering them. So cutting the scallops on each tube so they butt up nicely against each other to make the triangle. And then they are essentially tack welding them together with 3M glue, which is DP490, which I spotted, which is a very good epoxy. And then they're overwrapping them. So the first step is to mold the tubes. Now, there were a number of aluminium molds on the shelf, which is quite unusual in the bike industry because when you do have molded parts, whether it's just a front triangle or just a tube or just a head tube, they're normally steel. Because typically molding in aluminium with its very high thermal mismatch to carbon fiber can be problematic. However, they did show me a couple of molds that had kind of steel inserts inside an aluminium shell to make them a lot lighter and more manageable, which is kind of nice to see. And then here we can actually see a bottom bracket cluster and a seat tube cluster in the same part. And it got me thinking, well, if they're starting to do parts together, they're not doing kind of tube to tube anymore. And at what point do they just say, oh, do you know what? We'll just do a front triangle. And then they're in the realm of the big guys doing kind of front triangle molds or semi-monocoque molds. So it does seem like over the years they've kind of modularized their molding process a little bit more. So they're doing the head tube as a module, they're doing the BB and seat tube as a module, they're doing the chain stays and seat stays as a module, and it seems to me like they're slowly going away from tube to almost like modular / semi-monocoque molding. And I put that question to Davide, and here is his very diplomatic response. So Davide, you are in charge of cutting the frame tubes here and of using epoxy to glue the frames together before the joints get wrapped. If you mold all the tubes in-house, like the bottom bracket, the head tube, the seat tube, why don't you mold the whole frame? Why do you do it like this, modular?
Because you can make it custom.
Custom geometry. But for you still have set sizes. Maybe 6 range
Yours, both.
So would it make more sense to use one mold for just front triangle and rear triangle, or monocoque mold?
Yeah, I don't know if we can say something about this because it's something we think about.
Very, very, very knowledgeable guy. Very nice of him to speak such good English to us because our Italian is rubbish. So after gluing, the majority of that epoxy on the outside is sanded off, ready for overwrapping. Now it's the overwrapping that really unifies the structure and gives it its strength. They showed us basically a CNC cutting table where they cut the swatches of overwraps. They used to do them by hand using templates, but now I believe they have a parametric kind of CAD model, which depending on the custom geometry or depending on the 6 sizes, say the overwrap swatches are parametrically designed so they know exactly which ones to cut out. On this ride review, I've spotted like the print through of the overlapping overwraps, and that's essential to taper the stiffness. If you just had all of those overwraps stopping at the same part, not only would you get step in the carbon, your stiffness would transition from a very high stiffness part to a lower stiffness part, and you get a very high stiffness gradient and potential there for cracks and interlaminar shear, which you definitely don't want. So it's nice to see that they've, feathered those joins out. Each overwrap's got, I think, 3 or 4 overwraps depending on the size. So the larger bikes may be getting more reinforcement than the smaller bikes. When they do the overwraps are then only pressurized from the inside and outside at 1 atmosphere. So they're using a vacuum bag process, and it don't matter what you say, if you're doing it outside of an autoclave, if you're vacuum bagging, you're only getting 1 atmosphere. So you're getting 1 atmosphere from the inside, 1 atmosphere from the outside. And obviously, if you've watched my videos before on vacuum bagging and doing carbon repairs, you'll know how you can just compress a wall using atmosphere. So there's no tube crushing going on. But the downside of this, like I said, is you're not getting those high 6-7 bar pressures like you would get in an internally bladder molded frame in one piece. Even though they might be getting those pressures at the earlier stage when they're molding the tubes themselves. They're also making their own forks. It's obviously very light, so I was riding the SL, and I think out of all the bikes on the fleet, this was one of the lightest actually, apart from the wheels, which are a little bit heavy. I think the bike was 7.1 kilos in my size, which is pretty damn good, considering it was a 58 with not so light wheels on it, and that was quite competitive. Anyway, so after they're overwrapped, they are sanded again, and then Officine Matteo actually have their own paint shop, which they own in Italy down the road from the headquarters in Cuneo. That is pretty cool, and I think the upcharge for custom paint isn't that much either, and the sky's the limit with the custom paint, so that's really nice. If they double their numbers overnight, or if they double their numbers to next year, I'm not sure they would be able to carry on with this facility. The manufacturing method, probably yes, but the number of people would have to drastically go up, and I think they are looking to diverge away from that tube-to-tube construction pretty soon. And it wouldn't surprise me, looking at their modular molds, like I said, for certain tubes made with certain tubes in one mold, they're slowly going towards just one big mold. They've got the people to do the tool making in Italy. There would be a lot less hand sanding afterwards. For me, if they didn't go to that, I think it would be fairly bizarre if they didn't slowly move towards semi-monocoque front triangle, rear triangle molds. The problem is that their custom geometry. Their custom geometry would have to be done differently. I showed you a company at Bespoke last year, or was it this year? Earlier this year, that are doing a modular mold. So a monocoque mold, essentially, but variable geometry by adjusting the mold. They're called Gregario. But basically what they've got here is a custom geometry high-end road frame. A bit of a kick to the trend of custom frame. So normally if you get a custom frame, whether it's titanium, carbon, or aluminium, it's kind of a tube-to-tube construction, whether it's lugged or wrapped and kind of bonded. This is made in the traditional kind of high volume production sense of using a mold. The full thing is monocoque, so front and rear triangle in the same mold, monocoque, true monocoque structure, but they're able to do custom geometry, custom tube sizes, custom tube lengths, angles and everything from that monocoque mold. So they've actually patented their molding technology, and they're using other partners in, I think it's northern Italy somewhere, can't remember exactly where, but they've got autoclave procedure, and the molding procedure is completely adjustable. So you get the finish, the 3D shapes and the weight and the stiffness of a kind of high volume production carbon bike, which is molded, in a 2-half mold. But you get the adjustability of custom geometry as well. So that's kind of completely unique in the bike industry. And I've always thought, I did say to the guys there, I was like, I've always thought, why has no one done this? Why has no one made an adjustable mold or a modular mold that can be, you can still get your different tube shapes and sizes and geometries without having to buy 6 molds. So when your big bike brand, Specialized, Trek, Giant go and make a mold, they have to make 6 or 7 molds, 6 or 7 different sizes. Each mold weighs about 100 kilos of tool steel. It's a significant investment for a brand to tool up and make molds for bike frames, which is why carbon bikes tend to be very expensive. They need to pay back the mold costs. 6 or 7 molds may cost $80,000 to $100,000 in a supplier for a good one. So the payback time is very long. You've got to sell a number of units. The factory wants a high MOQ of units. You don't have that XL mold sitting on the shelf waiting to be used. You might make 20 medium frames and 1 XL frame. They're also moving their production to Cuneo, which is in the same town as Officine Matteo. So Officine Matteo is actually a very young brand. They were set up in 2019 by a guy called Giovanni Raffarello. I think he's a very keen cyclist. He then, I think, was also a team manager at one point. If you've never ridden in Piemonte, right from the kind of south side of Piemonte to the north side of Piemonte, I've been there before a couple of years ago. It's the most underrated cycling in Italy. You've got to check it out. There's nothing too massive in terms of the climbs. They're not crazy alpine climbs, but the passion for bikes is there, and it's really good to see. So it's not hard to figure out why a company has set up like this when they've got some existing composites manufacturing in place. Now, at the end of 2024, they had 20% investment. That investor is based in the UAE, and this is not the first time we've seen an Italian brand get private equity from the UAE. Look at Colnago and Chimera. Like, I went to the Y1 RS launch, the Colnago launch back in December. Most of that bike was actually developed by Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi. So these UAE investors are really putting some resources behind these Italian brands, but I really hope this brand can stay in Italy, because I think that's what makes a difference. Pinarello, I think they've really it's a shame they've been passed from Catterton to now a new buyer, Glazenberg, who was the CEO of a mining company, Glencore, and I think owns quite a big portion of Q365. So don't be surprised if you see Pinarello sponsoring Q365 next year. Now, is it possible to remain globally artisan? And that was the quote from the investor, the private equity investor back at the end of 2024, who is looking to drive the kind of distribution and marketing and sales reach of Officine Matteo. But if you do want to remain artisanal, are you just limited to a global outreach or reputation or brand? Can you actually achieve it with sales? Well, let's have a look at some others that may have achieved the same. Now, I mentioned in the start of the video, cooking pots. What's that got to do with this? Well, Le Creuset, cast iron cooking pots. You've probably heard of them. You've probably even got some in your kitchen. Your mum or dad might have some in the kitchen. They are still made in Frenois-le-Grand. Global reputation. Sales, pretty high. Numbers are still pretty high, but they've managed to still be a global artisan brand. Never sold out to offshore and manufacturing. They've made it work. Have you heard of John Lobb Shoes? John Lobb is a very high bootmaker or shoemaker, British brand, been around for ages. So John Lobb have a number of ateliers, like workshops, bespoke kind of in the bike industry. It would be composites workshops like that one called Pedemonte. They make your custom geometry stuff. So if you're looking for custom size shoes, if you've got golf ball bunions or wide feet, you can go to London, you can go to Paris to the John Lobb Atelier and get a custom shoe. However, they've managed to still do their normal frame sizes, i.e. their 6 bike frame sizes of shoes, or, you know, your 42 up to your 48 in terms of men's shoes. They've still managed to do those in the UK. So they've still got their core artisanal brand value in the UK, and they are making huge numbers, and they are still made in Northampton. And it's similar with another famous Italian brand. If you're into clay shooting like me, Beretta. So Beretta is one of the oldest shotgun makers still around, and they are going from strength to strength, but they still have this two-tier approach. But still, if you think of the name Beretta, you think made in Italy. But they have a highly automated, high volume production for the lower end guns, or I wouldn't say lower end guns, but the kind of bread and butter clay guns. They've got a custom division where you can go be measured for a custom stock, custom engraving, and they've got their custom side. But it all still happens in Italy, but they've made it work. This has been a really long video. Looking back to the ride review of the bike then, how did it ride? Well, I was on the SL, which is one of the lightest bikes in the range. It was fitted with Dura Ace. Unfortunately, the wheels and tyres, I think it was a demo bike, so like a fleet bike, which they use for their tour side of the business, the wheels were quite low end, the tyres are quite low end, and that kind of ruined it for me a little bit. Okay, I agree. I'm a bicycling freak. I can separate the ride quality between the frame, the wheels, and the tyres. However, if a more general user came on and had a problem with the tyres or a problem with the group set, any small component that goes wrong on that bike, even if it's got nothing to do with the frame, may look badly in marketing, in word of mouth. It was that far away from being an absolute top-end Ferrari of the bike world, but it had Zafiro Pro tyres, which are like 10 to 20 watts down on a decent fast roller Vittoria or GB5000 TR. So yeah, I can look past that and say, well, that doesn't affect the frame. That doesn't affect the ride quality of the frame. But if you're giving it out to any journalists or more general riders, they might say, oh yeah, it felt a bit sluggish, or the wheels didn't feel stiff, and they'll cast that as the Officine Matteo experience. But in terms of the bike frame, it was light, it was stiff. I really like the geometry. I was riding a 58. There are 2 sizes above that, and the 58 fit me really well. I like it quite short, and I like it quite low, so that geometry worked really well for me. It was very, very comfortable as well. Obviously, 27.2mm seat posts with a lot of seat posts sticking out, and I like the traditional compact frame geometry, sloping top tube, and it didn't have drop C stays. There's plenty of tyre clearance as well. My tyres made it up at 30mm, but you could probably even fit 34, 35 in there absolutely fine. So with the bike, yeah, it went absolutely fine. Can't fault it. You can still see the tube-to-tube construction, which is what they are showcasing at the end of the day. But if, like I said, if they do this two-tier approach to kind of more higher numbers, and they start to do things in the front triangle mold and a rear triangle mold, they can really experiment with frame shapes a lot more. Maybe they'll have an aero bike in future, maybe they'll have a more outweight climbing bike, and get away from this kind of tube-to-tube aesthetic, because it's not for everyone. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed that. We'll do some more case studies and more brands if I visit any soon. And yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe. Cheers.